The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling of horse sweat and open prairie, and Eleanor Voss nearly tossed it into the fire before she read a single word. She had been expecting correspondence from her aunt in St. Louis, a woman who wrote in careful, looping cursive and never misspelled a single syllable. What she received instead was a folded square of paper so creased and weathered it looked as though it had ridden through a dust storm tucked inside a boot. The handwriting was large and angular, pressed so hard into the paper that the letters nearly tore through the back side, and it smelled distinctly of saddle leather and something vaguely smoky, like a campfire that had burned itself down to embers sometime in the night before. Eleanor set her aunt's expected letter aside, curiosity tugging at her despite herself, and smoothed the strange missive flat on her kitchen table in Abilene, Kansas, in the early spring of 1873. She read it slowly, because reading it quickly was not possible. The spelling was catastrophic. The grammar was so tangled it could have been used to rope a steer. Whoever had written this letter had passion. That much was clear, tremendous, earnest, burning passion. But the mechanics of written language were about as foreign to the writer as the inside of a parlor seemed to be. The letter read, in part, "Dear Miss Voss, I am writing to you because my foreman Hector Ruiz says you're the schoolteacher here in Abilene, and that you is real smart about learning and such. I got a problem with my ranch, and I need some advice from a person who knows about legal papers, because I can't read the contract the land agent give me, and I don't want to sign nothing I don't understand. My name is James Calloway, and I run the Rocking Sea spread about 12 mile west of Abilene, and I would be obliged if you could help me. I promise I is a honest man and not trying to cause you no trouble." Eleanor read it twice. She sat back in her chair and pressed her lips together and tried very hard not to smile, because there was something so achingly sincere in the letter, something so transparently genuine and unguarded, that smiling felt like laughing at a man who was doing his absolute best and knew no better. She was 24 years old, Eleanor Voss, and she had come to Abilene from Ohio 3 years prior after the death of her father left her with two choices: either depend on relatives who did not particularly want her, or make something of herself in a place where schoolteachers were desperately needed, and the frontier offered a kind of freedom that Ohio, with all its established propriety, did not. She had chosen the frontier, and she had not regretted it, though it had not been easy. Teaching 15 children of varying ages in a single room with a leaking roof and a wood stove that smoked whenever the wind came from the northwest was not the life she had imagined, but it was hers, and she had built it with her own 2 hands, and she was proud of it. She took out a fresh piece of paper. She dipped her pen, and she wrote back to James Calloway of the Rocking Sea spread, 12 miles west. She answered his question first, explaining carefully that without seeing the contract she could not offer specific advice, but that she was familiar with the kinds of land agreements that unscrupulous agents were passing around the territory, and that he should under no circumstances sign anything before having it examined by a second party. She offered to read it for him if he wished to bring it to the schoolhouse on any afternoon between 3 and 5 o'clock. Then, because she could not help herself, and because she believed firmly that a man who wanted help with reading and legal papers ought at the very least to know that language itself had rules worth learning, she added a postscript. It was gentle. She meant it to be kind. She wrote that she had noticed several spelling and grammatical difficulties in his letter, and that she would be happy to assist him with those as well, should he be interested, as literacy was something she believed every person deserved access to regardless of their station or circumstances. She listed 3 corrections specifically: the misspelling of because, the confusion between your, and the double negative in don't want to sign nothing, explaining in plain and patient terms what the correct forms were and why. She signed it, "Yours in good faith, Eleanor Voss, schoolteacher, Abilene, Kansas." She folded it, sealed it with wax, and sent it with the post rider the following morning without thinking too much more about it. She did not expect a reply. Men on the frontier, in her experience, either accepted help graciously and disappeared, or bristled at the implication that they needed any and also disappeared. She expected James Calloway of the Rocking Sea to fall into one category or the other, and she went back to her classroom and her lessons and her leaking roof and tried not to think about the letter she had written or the strange smoky smell of the one she had received. She thought about it a great deal more than she intended. It was 11 days before the reply came. It arrived in the same condition as the first, heavily creased, forcefully penned, smelling of the outdoors in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. Eleanor opened it at her kitchen table on a Thursday evening with her tea growing cold at her elbow. The letter began, "Dear Miss Voss," and she noticed immediately that he had spelled both words correctly this time. She felt something warm move through her chest before she had even finished reading the salutation. The letter continued, "I received your letter and I thank you for the advice about the contract. I brung it to a lawyer in town, and he said the same thing you did, that there was clauses in it not in my favor and I did not sign it. The land agent was not pleased, but I was. So I owe you a debt." She noticed that "received" was still misspelled and that "brought" had been rendered as "brung." But she also noticed that he had already corrected because, "and you're" in this letter, deploying them with a care that suggested he had reread her postscript several times. She read on. "You said in your letter you could help me with my spelling and such. I'm not a man who is easy embarrassed, but I will admit I felt some red in my face reading your postscript. Nobody ever corrected me before. My mama died when I was 7, and my daddy wasn't much for schooling, and I started working cattle at 10 years old. I can read some and write some, but not good. Not well. You wrote not well, so I put that instead." Eleanor set the letter down. She pressed her fingers against her mouth. He had corrected himself within the letter, mid-sentence, remembering what she had written. She picked the letter up again. "I would like to take you up on the offer of the letters about spelling, and also the offer to read legal papers, because I have another contract coming that I need to look at. But Miss Voss, I will say something else, and you can think what you like of it. Nobody ever corrected my grammar before, and nobody ever bothered to explain why the correct way was correct. You explained it like it mattered that I understand and not just that I comply. That was kindly done, and I appreciated it more than I can say, which isn't saying much because I am not good with words, as you can plainly see. I would like to keep writing to you if you are agreeable, about the letters and such, but also about other things if you wouldn't mind. James Calloway." Eleanor read the letter 3 more times that evening. She wrote back the following morning. She corrected "received" and "embarrassed," and "because" again, gently and thoroughly, with explanations as she had given before, and she answered his question about the new contract by requesting that he send it along with his next letter. She wrote about the schoolhouse and the children and the long Kansas spring that was finally beginning to show green at the edges of the brown prairie. She wrote more than she had intended to write, and she caught herself 3 times starting to ask questions about him, about the ranch, about what it was like to have started working cattle at 10 years old, questions that had nothing to do with spelling or contracts. She asked them anyway. She folded the letter. She sent it. She told herself she was simply being neighborly. She was a schoolteacher. This was what schoolteachers did. The exchange of letters became a regular rhythm over the following weeks, arriving on Tuesdays and Thursdays with the post, or sometimes on Saturdays when the post rider made a special run. James Calloway's spelling improved in stages, not all at once, but in visible, deliberate increments that told Eleanor he was studying her corrections and applying them with tremendous seriousness of purpose. He still made mistakes, many of them, but they were different mistakes each time, which meant he was not repeating the old ones, which she found more impressive than if he had been perfectly literate to begin with. His writing, beyond the mechanics of it, was something she had not expected. He wrote the way he apparently thought, which was directly and honestly and without pretension, and with a dry humor that arrived unexpectedly and made her laugh out loud alone in her kitchen, in a way that she had not laughed in quite some time. He wrote about a calf that had gotten stuck in the creek and required the combined efforts of 3 grown men and a very reluctant mule to extract, the telling of which took up an entire page and was so vivid she felt she could see it. He wrote about the way the sky above the rocking sea looked at dusk, when the light went orange and then purple, and the first stars came out one at a time like lanterns being lit in a very large house. He wrote about his foreman, Hector Ruiz, who was apparently a man of tremendous competence and extremely strong opinions about the correct way to treat a horse, and who had given James no end of grief about the letter writing. "Hector says I am making a fool of myself," James wrote in one letter. "He says a schoolteacher in town has no interest in letters from a cowboy who can't spell. I told him that you keep writing back, so maybe he is wrong. He said maybe you are just being polite. I would like to know which it is, but I am not going to ask you directly because that would be embarrassing." He had spelled embarrassing correctly that time, and she had pressed her fingers against the word and smiled. She wrote back, "It is neither politeness nor foolishness. I write back because I want to. Please tell Hector Ruiz he is wrong." She sent the letter and then sat in her kitchen for a long moment staring at the place where it had been and wondering at herself. The spring deepened into a full Kansas May, warm and windy and enormous, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with an anticipation that had nothing to do with teaching schedules or professional correspondence. She knew this. She was honest enough with herself to know it plainly and to examine it without flinching. She was a practical woman who had built a practical life, and she was well aware that exchanging letters with a rancher she had never met was not the most sensible foundation for anything. She was also aware that the letters had become the most interesting part of her weeks, that she read them more than once and kept them in a cedar box under her bed, which she had told herself was simply because she was a person who kept things organized. It was not because she was a person who kept things organized. She had learned, by this point, a great deal about James Calloway. He was 28 years old. He had been born in Missouri and come west at 15 with a cattle drive and never gone back. He had worked as a ranch hand for 9 years, saving nearly every cent of his wages, before purchasing the rocking sea 3 years ago from an aging rancher who was moving to live with his daughter in Denver. The ranch was 460 acres of good grassland, with a creek that ran reliably through the summer, and James spoke of it with the particular reverence that men reserved for things they had worked very hard to earn. He had 7 horses, 4 working dogs, and 30 head of cattle that he was building into a larger herd, and Hector Ruiz, who had been his friend since James was 17 and Hector was 21, and who was the best stockman James had ever seen. He had also, cautiously and in carefully spelled sentences, begun writing about himself in a more personal way, not about the ranch, but about the man who ran it. He wrote about the loneliness of long days when the only voice he heard was his own or Hector's, which he noted was essentially the same, since they had known each other long enough to know what the other was going to say before he said it. He wrote about the feeling of looking at the rocking sea at the end of a day and knowing it was his, but also knowing it was only his, that there was no one waiting for him in the house except the dogs, who were good company but limited in the area of conversation. He never wrote these things plaintively. He wrote them the way he seemed to write everything, directly, without asking for sympathy, simply stating the truth of his situation and leaving it there on the page. Eleanor read those passages more times than she counted. She had written to him once, carefully, about her own life, about Ohio and her father and the choice she had made to come west, and about the particular kind of freedom that the frontier offered a woman who was willing to work for it, and also about the particular limitations that the same frontier placed on a woman who was not married, which were numerous and occasionally infuriating. She wrote about this forthrightly because she had found that writing to James Calloway had a way of making her forthright, perhaps because He was so consistently forthright himself. She did not dress things up for him the way she sometimes dressed them up for her aunt in St. Louis or the women she was friendly with in town. She told him the truth of things, and he seemed to receive the truth of things without discomfort, which she found remarkable. His reply had come back with a sentence she had read so many times the ink was beginning to blur slightly at the edges where her fingers had touched it. "You sound like a woman who should not be alone either," he had written, "and I mean that in every way I am capable of meaning something." She had written back, "I believe I understand your meaning completely." And that, for a little while, was as far as either of them went on paper. There were practical matters as well, of course, because neither of them was the kind of person who could exist entirely in the air of sentiment without some ballast of practicality. She read 2 more contracts for him and identified difficulties in both of them, which James reported back had saved him considerable money and aggravation. He had begun to ask her questions about mathematics, specifically about how to calculate the carrying capacity of his pasture land, and how to figure the profit margin on beef prices he was getting at market. And she had answered these questions at length with real pleasure, because mathematics was something she enjoyed, and almost never got to discuss with anyone who wanted to discuss it. He had sent her, along with one letter in late May, a small bundle of dried prairie wildflowers wrapped in brown paper, with a note that said only, "These were growing by the creek this morning, and they seemed like something you might like. I hope they survived the ride." 3 of them had survived, purple and yellow and small, and Eleanor had pressed them between the pages of a dictionary. She had sent him, in return, a book. It was a copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, which she had read twice, and which she thought he would enjoy on the grounds that it was a story about a man who came from very little and built himself into something more, and because Dickens wrote with a warmth and humor that she suspected would suit him. She had written in the front cover, "For James, who is improving his grammar admirably, and who might enjoy meeting someone else who did the same. E.V." His response, which had arrived 9 days later, was the longest letter he had ever written, 4 full pages, and he said that he had read the first 100 pages in 2 sittings, and that he thought Pip was a fool, but an understandable kind of fool, and that Miss Havisham frightened him more than any person he had met in real life, and he had met some alarming people in his time. He said that reading the book made him think about the difference between who a person was and who a person could become, and whether the distance between those 2 things was a gap to be ashamed of or a journey to be proud of. "I think it is the second thing," he wrote. "I am deciding to think it is the second thing." Eleanor put that letter in the cedar box with the others and sat quietly in her kitchen for a very long while. It was Hector Ruiz who forced the issue, in a manner of speaking. James wrote in early June that Hector had read one of Eleanor's letters, not by James's invitation, but because James had left it on the table, and Hector had apparently been unable to resist his curiosity, and that Hector's verdict was that Eleanor Voss sounded like an intelligent and genuine woman, and that James was wasting everyone's time by trading letters when he could simply ride to Abilene and say what he meant in person. He said a man who rides all day for a living ought to be able to manage 12 miles, James wrote. Hector is frequently right about things which is irritating. There was a pause in the letter, a visible one, a longer gap between the lines than usual, as though James had put down his pen and picked it up again. "I have been thinking about it myself," he wrote. "I think about coming to Abilene more than is probably reasonable. I haven't because I didn't know if you would want that, a stranger showing up from letters alone. You know my handwriting better than my face, and there's a difference between the 2, but I wanted you to know I've thought about it." He had spelled everything correctly except weren't, which he had written as wasn't, and she did not correct it this time. She set the letter down and pressed both hands flat on the table and made a decision. She wrote back the same evening. She corrected the spelling of wasn't, gently and briefly, and then she wrote the rest of the letter, which was not brief at all. She told him that she had also thought about it, more than she would have admitted to anyone other than him in a letter. She told him that the distinction between knowing a person's handwriting and knowing their face was a real one, and that she did not wish to minimize it. She told him that she was not a woman who made decisions impulsively or who said things she did not mean, and that what she was about to write she meant entirely. "You have been correcting your grammar because I asked you to," she wrote. "You read the corrections carefully, you remember them, and you apply them without resentment, which tells me something important about the kind of man you are. I think I would very much like to correct your grammar in person. If you are willing to ride the 12 miles, I am willing to receive you." She signed it the way she always did, "Yours in good faith, Eleanor Voss," and then, after a pause of her own, she added below the signature, "though perhaps simply yours at this point, if that is agreeable." She sent the letter and spent the following 3 days in a state of sustained agitation that she managed, outwardly, with complete composure, because she was Eleanor Voss, and she was not the kind of woman who let her composure show cracks in public. But in private, in her small house attached to the schoolhouse on the western edge of Abilene, she rearranged her kitchen twice, cleaned windows that did not need cleaning, and read Dickens without retaining any of it. The reply came in 4 days, which was faster than any letter he had sent before. It was very short, barely half a page, and the handwriting was slightly larger than usual, pressed into the paper with the same force he always used but somehow more emphatic. "Miss Voss," it said, "I will be in Abilene on Saturday the 14th. I will come to the schoolhouse at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as you suggested is your best time for visitors. I am better on a horse than I am on paper, so if this letter is not saying what I wanted to say, please know that what I wanted to say is that I am very glad you wrote back, and that Saturday cannot come soon enough. Your grammar will be corrected in person as requested. Yours, James Calloway." Then below that, in smaller writing that looked like it had been added after some thought, "I am also nervous, which is not something I admit often. I thought you should know." Eleanor read that last line and laughed, and the laugh was so unexpected and so genuine that it startled her cat, a large orange animal named Copernicus, who spent most of his time on her windowsill and regarded the world with deep suspicion. He leaped off the sill with great dignity and disappeared under the bed, and Eleanor sat at her table laughing at a letter and pressing it against her heart like a woman in a novel she would have considered sentimental a year ago. She was also nervous. She thought it was only fair that he know. She wrote back a single line, "I'm also nervous. Saturday will arrive regardless." Saturday arrived. Eleanor had spent Friday evening in a state of carefully controlled preparation. She had set out her best day dress, which was a deep blue wool that she thought suited her coloring, and which she had not worn since she had attended a social function at the church 6 months prior. She had washed her hair and braided it back in the way she wore it when she wanted to look composed rather than hurried. She had cleaned the schoolhouse, which she did regularly anyway, but which she cleaned this time with particular attention to the front steps and the windowsills. She had also baked a pie, because she was a practical woman and practical women offered their guests something when they called, and because baking gave her hands something to do and her mind something to focus on that was not the clock. By 2:30 on Saturday afternoon she was seated at her teacher's desk in the schoolhouse, the children long since dismissed for the weekend, attempting to mark arithmetic papers with a red pencil and not listening for the sound of a horse. She heard the horse at 8 minutes before 3. She set down the red pencil. She straightened her back. She took a breath. The knock at the schoolhouse door was firm, 3 solid raps, the knock of a man who did things deliberately. "Come in," she said, and her voice was steady, which she counted as a minor miracle. The door opened, and James Calloway came in out of the June afternoon, and Eleanor Voss, who had imagined this moment in various ways over the preceding weeks, found that she had not imagined it correctly. He was tall, taller than she had pictured, with broad shoulders and hands that were large and calloused and very brown from the sun. He had taken off his hat when he came through the door, which she noted immediately, and he was holding it in both hands by the brim and turning it slightly, which was the only sign of the nervousness he had admitted to in writing. His hair was dark and his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that she had not expected, and that were, at this moment, fixed on her with a directness that matched every single letter he had ever written. He was not what she would have called classically handsome, because his nose had been broken at least once, and his jaw was too square, and there was a scar above his left eyebrow that had not healed cleanly, but he had a face that was entirely itself, honest and weathered and real, and Eleanor found that she preferred that enormously. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she stood from behind her desk, and they looked at each other across the length of a classroom and nobody spoke. Then he said, "You are not what I pictured," she said. "Neither are you." He seemed to be deciding whether that was good or bad, and she decided to spare him the uncertainty. "I mean it favorably," she said. Something in his face relaxed, something she had not even been sure was tension until it eased. "So do I," he said. She gestured toward the chairs that the older children used, which were somewhat more adult in their dimensions, and asked if he would like to sit, and he said yes. And he sat in one of them with the hat still in his hands and his long legs stretched out in front of him. And she sat in another chair and turned to face him. And for a moment neither of them seemed to know how to begin a conversation that had been going on for 2 months already. She said, "How was the ride?" He said, "Good." "The creek is running high from the spring rains," she said. "Is that unusual?" he said. "Not for June. June's usually got some water in it." He paused. "That sentence doesn't make sense exactly." "I mean June usually has water in the creek." She smiled, and she saw him register the smile with something that was almost visible relief. "You corrected yourself," she said. "I'm in the presence of a schoolteacher," he said. Seemed appropriate. They talked. It was, after the first few minutes of careful navigation, unexpectedly easy. The way it was easy in the letters, but without the delay, without waiting 11 days for the reply. The conversation simply moving forward in real time, and taking turns the way conversations were supposed to. He was drier in person than even the letters had suggested, with a humor that arrived so quietly she almost missed it the first time and then laughed when she caught it. And he seemed to enjoy very much when she laughed, though he did not show this overtly, only a slight shift at the corners of his mouth. She had brought the pie, a dried apple pie from the last of her winter stores, and she cut them each a piece, and they ate it with the afternoon light coming through the schoolhouse windows and lying in long yellow bars across the floor. And James Calloway looked around the classroom with a serious, attentive expression that she recognized from his letters. "What do you look like?" she asked, and then felt her face go warm because she had not meant to say that out loud. He looked at her. "You mean what do I think of?" he said, translating her somewhat scrambled sentence with an ease that told her he understood her, which was disarming. "Yes," she said, deciding to own the question fully. "What do you think of it?" He considered the classroom, the rough walls with their spelling charts and arithmetic tables, the rows of small desks, the battered globe in the corner that had lost its stand and now leaned against the wall at an angle that made it look as though the world were slightly tilted, the wood stove with its crooked pipe, the bookshelf that was full but very clearly full by careful selection and not by abundance. "I think," he said, "that someone worked very hard to make this feel like something, like it mattered." He paused. "It does matter." Eleanor looked at her classroom through his eyes for a moment and felt something shift in her chest. "It matters enormously," she said quietly. They sat for a while in a comfortable kind of quiet that she had not expected to find with someone she had only just met in person. Though of course she had not only just met him. Not really. She had been meeting him in increments for 2 months. And she knew the weight of his thoughts and the rhythm of his humor and the way he applied himself to hard things. And those were not small things to know about a person. He asked her about the contract she had mentioned in her last letter, the one for grazing rights on the parcel east of his property, and she had questions about the exact language of the relevant clause, and they spent a very pleasant and focused 20 minutes going through it together. James reading the section she indicated in a voice that was careful and deliberate, and showed the work he had been putting in, and Eleanor explaining the legal implications in plain language. "You should have been a lawyer," he said, after they had resolved the final ambiguous clause to his satisfaction. "Women don't practice law," she said, without bitterness, simply as a statement of fact. He looked at her steadily. "That's a waste," he said. She had not expected that response, and it caught her somewhere beneath her composure. "Yes," she said, "I think so too." He stayed for 3 hours. He said when he finally stood and put his hat back on that he needed to ride back before dark, and she walked him out to the front of the schoolhouse where his horse, a solid bay gelding, was standing patiently at the hitching post. He had brought saddlebags, and from one of them he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something," he said, and handed it over with the directness that characterized everything he did. She opened it to find 2 jars of honey, very good honey, dark and thick, with a label in his handwriting that said, "Rocking Sea, June 1873," spelled correctly. "We have bees," he said. "Hector tends them. He said I couldn't come empty-handed, and he was right." "Thank Hector," she said. "I will." He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the horse with the easy competence of a man who had done this 10,000 times, and then he sat there for a moment looking down at her with those gray-green eyes in the evening light, and Eleanor held the jars of honey and looked back up at him. "I'd like to come back," he said. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded once, the way he did things when he had made a decision and it was settled. "Next Saturday," he said. "Next Saturday," she agreed. He rode out of Abilene with the evening sun behind him, and Eleanor stood in front of the schoolhouse until he was past the edge of her vision, and then she went inside and opened her Dickens and could not read a word of it. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that. The rides became the rhythm that the letters had been, something to look forward to through the week, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it directly for a while, because there was a particular pleasure in the approach of a thing before the arrival of it, and they were both people who understood that pleasure intuitively. He began to learn her, the way she had been learning him through the letters. He learned that she was quieter than he expected when she was thinking hard about something, that the silence was not absence but concentration, and he learned not to interrupt it. He learned that she had very clear convictions about things, and that she would state them plainly and without apology, and then listen carefully to any counterargument and revise if the counterargument was good, which he found to be an admirable and not particularly common trait. He learned that she liked mathematics and Dickens and strong tea and early mornings, and that she had a dry streak of her own that matched his in ways that made conversation between them a particular kind of pleasure. She learned that he was patient in the way that only people who have spent long hours alone with animals and open land can be patient, which was not passivity but a genuine and settled comfort with the pace of things. She learned that he was scrupulously fair, that it was not simply a trait he deployed in business matters, but something he seemed to apply to everything, a kind of constitutional commitment to treating things as they actually were rather than as he might prefer them to be. She learned that he read slowly and deliberately, and that he remembered everything he read, which meant that, by the 4th Saturday visit, he was making references to Pip and Herbert Pocket with an ease that made her want to hand him every book she owned. She did, eventually, nearly hand him every book she owned. He borrowed one at a time and returned it the following Saturday, and they discussed it while she corrected the letters he had written during the week, which he still brought, because they had agreed early on that the letter writing was good practice, and he was not going to stop until his grammar was completely reliable, and also because the letters had become something else by then, something neither of them was willing to give up. The visits widened. He brought Hector one Saturday in late June, having apparently decided that Eleanor should meet the man who featured so prominently in his letters, and Hector Ruiz turned out to be a compact, dark-eyed man of 32 with excellent manners, and an expression that Eleanor could only describe as quietly appraising, which she did not take personally because she was also quietly appraising him. He shook her hand when they were introduced and said, "He has been a different man since the letters started," which made James's jaw tighten in a way that Eleanor found extremely endearing. "Hector," James said. "It is a compliment," Hector said, entirely untroubled. Eleanor offered them both coffee and pie, because she had discovered that James Calloway had a genuine weakness for her dried apple pie. And over coffee Hector told her 3 stories about James that James clearly wished had not been told, including the incident with the calf and the creek, which she already knew from the letter, but which was significantly funnier when told by a witness. She invited, the following week, her friend Margaret Hale, who taught at the church Sunday school and was the person in Abilene Eleanor trusted most, to come by the schoolhouse when James was there. Margaret was warm and forthright and sharp, and Eleanor wanted James to know the kind of company she kept, and she also, if she was honest, wanted someone who knew her well to meet him. Margaret's verdict, delivered the following Monday morning over Eleanor's kitchen table, was succinct. "He looks at you like a man who has decided something," she said, "and I think you have decided something too, so the only question is which of you is going to say it first." Eleanor said that she didn't know what Margaret was talking about and poured her more tea, and Margaret accepted the tea with a smile that said she knew exactly what Eleanor was talking about. It was Hector, as it turned out, who said something first, though not in the way anyone had anticipated. In early July, Hector sent Eleanor a letter of his own, which arrived separately from James's weekly letter and which she opened with some surprise. It was brief and written in a clear, educated hand, which told her something about Hector that the letters had not previously conveyed. "Miss Voss," it said, "I am writing to you without James's knowledge, and I hope you will forgive the presumption. He is my oldest friend and a good man, and he is in the habit of taking a very long time to act on things he has decided, because he is careful in that way. He has decided something about you. I'm not telling you what it is because I think you already know and because it is his to tell. I'm only writing to ask you to be patient with the pace of it because he is not slow, he is careful, and there is a difference. He values you very much. I think you know that too. Respectfully, Hector Ruiz." Eleanor read this letter in her kitchen with Copernicus watching from the windowsill and the July morning sun coming through the windows, and she thought about it for a long time. She was patient. She was also honest with herself, which meant she knew that being patient had a different quality to it now, a warmer, more certain quality, because Hector's letter had confirmed something she had been hoping rather than knowing. James came on Saturday as usual. They sat on the front steps of the schoolhouse in the early evening warmth, the way they had begun to sit when the weather was fine, side by side with the Kansas sky going orange above them, and he was in the middle of telling her something about a problem with the east fence line when he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her. "Can I say something?" he said. "You generally say whatever you are thinking," she said, "which I appreciate." He looked at the horizon for a moment, then back at her. "I didn't come 12 miles just for grammar lessons." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I came because I wanted to know you," he said. "And I do know you now. Not all of you, not yet, but enough to know that I want the rest. All of it. I'm not good at this kind of saying, I'm better at the doing, but I didn't want to be someone who did without saying first. So I'm saying." Eleanor felt something settle in her, something that had been held very carefully for a long time. "I wanted to know you too," she said. "And I also know enough now to know I want the rest." She paused. "For what it is worth, you are considerably better at this kind of saying than you give yourself credit for." He was looking at her with an expression that she could not entirely read, which was unusual because she had become fairly good at reading his expressions over the past months, and she thought that perhaps it was because the expression was too many things at once to separate out, something that was relief and warmth, and something else that she recognized because she felt it too. He reached out and took her hand, which was resting on her knee, and he held it the way he held things he intended to keep, with his whole hand and a steadiness that was characteristic of him. And they sat on the schoolhouse steps in the July evening and watched the Kansas sky go through all its colors while the prairie stretched out in every direction around them. And the first stars came out one at a time like lanterns being lit in a very large house. She thought of the letter where he had written that, the lanterns in a very large house, and she thought about the fact that he had been describing this same sky when he wrote it. And she felt something that she would have described if asked, not as happiness exactly but as rightness, as the feeling of a thing being what it was supposed to be. He asked her in August if she would come to the rocking sea. He asked her in a letter first, because he said he wanted to ask properly, and he thought better when he was writing, which she found to be an endearing reversal of how he had begun, and the letter was very well composed. He wrote that he wanted her to see the ranch, the land and the creek and the bees and the horses, all the things he had described, because description was one thing and the place itself was another, and also because he wanted her to see where he lived and who he was in that context, not just who he was in a schoolhouse on a Saturday afternoon. She said yes, she would come on Sunday when the school was not in session, and that she would ride there herself because she was a passable rider and 12 miles was not beyond her, and that she would bring lunch because she felt it was appropriate. She rode out to the rocking sea on a Sunday morning in early August, with a basket of food and Copernicus's resentful gaze following her out the door. The ride took her through the kind of Kansas prairie that was so wide and so open it felt like being at the bottom of a bowl full of sky, the grass tall on either side of the track, and the wind moving through it in long, slow waves. And she understood, riding through it, something she had only partially understood before, why James wrote about this landscape the way he did. There was something in it that got into you, something in the scale of it and the silence of it, a silence that was not actually silent but made of wind and grasshoppers and distant bird song, and the sound of her horses' hooves on the dry earth. The rocking sea appeared gradually, first a windmill, and then the roofline of the main house, and then the whole of it. A modest place by the standards of a wealthy man, but a fine place by the standards of a man who had built it from nothing, with a good barn and a solid fence line, and the creek she had heard so much about glittering through the cottonwoods to the south. James came out to meet her before she reached the gate, on foot, having apparently seen her coming from some distance. She reined up and he caught her horse's bridle and looked up at her with an expression she now knew well, which was the expression he used when he was glad about something and not trying to make a production of it. "You found it," he said. "You gave good directions," she said. He helped her down with a practicality that was also, somehow, very much not merely practical, the steadiness of his hands at her waist and the way he did not let go immediately when she was on the ground. And she stood looking up at him in the August morning and thought that Hector's letter had been right about the way James looked at her, because she had never quite seen herself in someone else's eyes the way she seemed to see herself in his. He showed her the ranch. He showed her everything with the same serious attention he brought to everything else, the barn and the horses, the creek and the cottonwoods, the beehives in the east corner of the property where the clover was thick, the kitchen garden that he confessed Hector had planted because James's efforts at gardening had been, in his own assessment, a humiliation. He showed her the house, which was clean and spare and organized with the same deliberateness he brought to his letter writing, everything in a place that made sense, nothing wasted. She showed him, in return, the things she had brought for lunch, which she laid out on the table that served as the kitchen and dining area both, and they sat across from each other and ate and talked, and the conversation was the kind that could have gone on for the rest of the day and seemed inclined to, ranging from the price of beef at market to the latest developments in the Dickens, which he was now well into. to the question of whether the new schoolhouse that the town council had been discussing for 3 years was ever actually going to get built. In the afternoon, they walked along the creek, and he showed her where the calf had gotten stuck, pointing out the specific bend in the bank with a grave expression that made her laugh until she had to stop walking. Hector, who had made himself scarce for most of the day with the skill of a man who understood when discretion was required, appeared at supper time and joined them for coffee, and was entirely pleasant and entirely himself. And she liked him very much, and she could see how much he and James had been a kind of family to each other out here on the rocking sea, two men who had arrived in this place with very little and built something between them. And the understanding of that made her think differently about the loneliness James had described in his letters, made it more textured and more specific. She rode home in the early evening with the sky going its best colors and the grass golden around her, and she thought about the kitchen table and the creek and the way James had looked at her against the backdrop of his own life, and she thought about what Margaret had said about deciding things. She had decided something. The question of how to say it was one she thought about for the following week, and the answer she arrived at, which she suspected James would appreciate enormously for its symmetry, was to put it in a letter. She wrote to him on a Thursday evening, a long and careful letter that said many things, about the ranch and the ride and the afternoon by the creek and Hector and the kitchen garden, and then at the end it said the thing she had been working toward since she started writing it. "I have been thinking," she wrote, "about what you said in August and what I said in return, that we each wanted to know the rest of the other. I have been to the rocking sea now, and I have seen your life in its place, and I know considerably more than I did before. I want to be honest with you, because I have always tried to be honest with you, and I do not wish to change that habit now. I think I am in love with you. I am not certain of the timing or the protocol of saying such a thing, but I know that I think it, and I know that I would rather say it and risk the awkwardness than not say it and lose the chance. You told me once that you wanted to be someone who said before he did, 'I am trying to do the same. Yours, Eleanor.'" She sent it, and did not sleep particularly well that Thursday night. His reply came in 3 days, which was the fastest he had ever written back, which told her something before she had even unfolded the paper. He had written, "Dear Eleanor, I have read your letter 4 times. I am not going to correct the spelling of anything in this letter because I want to write it fast, and I don't want to slow down to think about spelling. I have been in love with you since the second letter you wrote me, the one where you said your corrections were meant kindly. Nobody had ever done anything for me that was meant that way, just kindly, without a reason behind it. Everything since then has just been more of the same thing getting bigger. I am going to ride to Abilene on Saturday, and I am going to ask you something when I get there that I would ask in this letter if I thought it was the right way to ask it. But some things should be said out loud and not on paper. I think this is one of them. Wait for me on Saturday. Yours always, James. P.S. I misspelled several things in this letter intentionally so you would have something to do. That is not true. I just wrote fast." Eleanor read the postscript 3 times and laughed each time. He came on Saturday, and he asked her, and she said yes. And the particulars of the asking were private in the way that the most important moments tend to be private, occurring between 2 people in a specific light at a specific moment in a way that belongs entirely to them, and resists translation into any other form, even a very good one. What can be said is that he was standing in the schoolhouse when he asked, the same schoolhouse where they had first met, and that she was standing 3 feet from him and looking at his face, which she had come to know very well over the preceding months, and that when she said yes something in him went entirely quiet in a way that told her the asking had cost him more than he showed, and that the yes was everything he had hoped it would be. She went to tell Margaret, who cried and was not embarrassed about it, and said that she had seen this coming since the day she met him. Eleanor's aunt in St. Louis wrote a letter expressing concerns about frontier cowboys and practical considerations that Eleanor answered with patient affection, and complete disregard for the advice it contained. They were married in September of 1873 in the small church in Abilene, with Hector Ruiz standing up with James and Margaret Hale standing up with Eleanor, and the 15 children of the Abilene schoolhouse in attendance, because Eleanor had invited them on the grounds that it seemed to her that children should see adults being happy whenever possible. It was a clear September day with the sky the particular blue that September produced on the Kansas prairie, a blue so clean and deep it looked like the sky in a painting of itself. James wore his best clothes, which were clean and pressed but still unmistakably the clothes of a man who worked with his hands and spent his days outside, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk up the aisle with an expression that she felt rather than saw, because she was concentrating on not tripping and on the extraordinary sensation of the moment. But she felt it anyway, and it settled something in her that had been gently vibrating since Thursday. The minister, a decent man named Reverend Clark who had been in Abilene for 5 years and had seen Eleanor through some difficult stretches of those 5 years and thought very well of her, performed the ceremony with warmth and a minimum of fuss, which suited them both. Hector cried, quietly and without drawing attention to it, and when James noticed later, he said absolutely nothing, which was exactly the right response. They went back to the rocking sea. Eleanor closed the schoolhouse for 2 weeks, having arranged for Margaret to conduct a reduced schedule for the older children in her absence, and she and James spent those 2 weeks at the ranch in a kind of close and particular happiness that she had not known to want and now could not imagine being without. She explored the ranch thoroughly, with James's company when he was not working and on her own when he was, and she began to understand the land the way she had begun to understand him, in layers, with each new thing revealing something about the last thing she had learned. She rearranged the kitchen slightly, because she could see 3 things that would make it more efficient, and James had told her straightforwardly that she should make the house whatever it needed to be for her to feel it was hers, which was one of the things she loved about him, the complete absence of possessiveness in him, the genuine desire for her to inhabit their shared life fully and without apology. She added her books to the shelf in the main room, which nearly doubled its contents, and James spent a long evening looking at all the new titles with the focused pleasure he brought to every encounter with books. She went back to teaching in October, riding out to the rocking sea in the evenings and on weekends, and the arrangement was not without its difficulties. 12 miles twice a day was a long ride in the Kansas winter, and they discussed it at length and practically, which was how they discussed things they needed to work out. They agreed that she would stay in Abilene during the week when the weather was bad and come home to the ranch on the weekends, and that they would think more carefully about what they wanted once the school year finished in the spring. The letter writing did not stop entirely. It changed in character, because they were not separated by ignorance of each other anymore, but they continued to write, notes left on the kitchen table, shorter letters sent when one of them was in town and the other was at the ranch, little dispatches of observation and thought that had grown out of the correspondence, and that neither of them was willing to give up. James's writing had improved enormously by this point, smoothly and confidently grammatical in most respects, and he had developed a written voice that was entirely his own, clean and exact and occasional deeply funny, and Eleanor had told him more than once that he was a natural writer in the deepest sense, that the mechanics had just been getting in the way. He wrote to her one Tuesday in November, a note left on the kitchen table for her to find when she came in from the barn. "You corrected my grammar and I became a person who writes. That seems like an important thing to say out loud, so I am saying it on paper, which is where I am best. I love you. Your handwriting is still better than mine, but I am working on it, James." She wrote back on the same piece of paper below his words, "My handwriting is considerably better than yours. This is one area where I do not expect improvement to fully close the gap, and I do not mind. I love you too, Eleanor. P.S. You left a comma splice in the second sentence, and I am choosing not to correct it because it is charming." He found it that evening and laughed, and the sound of him laughing in the kitchen, while she was at the table across the room, was something she added to the category of things she had not known to want and now could not imagine being without. In the spring of 1874, with the school year ending and the prairie going green again with a thoroughness that never entirely failed to astonish her, Eleanor discovered that she was expecting a child. She told James on a Saturday morning in the kitchen of the rocking sea, while he was drinking his coffee and looking out the window at the east pasture where 3 new calves had appeared in the past week, the result of what he described as an exceptionally productive spring in every possible respect. She told him plainly and directly, because those were the terms on which they communicated, and watched his face. He set down the coffee cup very carefully. He turned from the window and looked at her. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands in both of his and stood there holding them and looking at her with that expression that was too many things to separate out, and said, "Are you all right? Are you feeling all right?" The first question, she thought. Not anything about himself or his feelings or what this meant for the ranch or the future. The first question was whether she was all right. "Yes," she said. "I am very well." He pulled her against him and she felt him exhale, a long, slow breath against her hair, and he said quietly, "Good, good, that's the important thing." She could feel that he was overwhelmed, that the enormity of it was moving through him in waves, but he held it with the same steadiness he brought to everything. "A boy, I hope," he said after a long moment, "though I don't suppose I get a vote." "You get a hope," she said. "The determination is somewhat above your jurisdiction." He laughed at that, low and real, and held her closer. She did not go back to teaching in the fall. She had always planned to, and then September came, and with it the reality of the last months of her pregnancy. And the school board, which was composed of 4 men who were broadly supportive of Eleanor but not constitutionally capable of imagining a heavily pregnant schoolteacher standing in front of a classroom, asked her gently to take the term off. She was not happy about it. She and James discussed it, and she decided to concede the point, though she made it clear to the school board that she intended to return after the child was born and that they should plan accordingly, which they agreed to, slightly nervously. She spent the fall at the rocking sea, which was not the hardship it might have been for a woman of different temperament, because she found the ranch in the autumn to be a place of deep and particular beauty. The cottonwoods along the creek going gold and the grass curring to its winter bronze, and the sky doing what the Kansas sky did in October, which was turn a color for which she had not previously had an adequate word, but which James, in a letter written before they met, had described as the blue that makes you think somebody meant it. She had thought about that description many times and thought about it again now. She worked on the correspondence she had begun handling for James, because the business of a working ranch involved a great deal of paper, contracts and invoices and letters to the Cattlemen's Association and to buyers in Kansas City and Wichita, and James was capable of managing all of it now, his reading and writing entirely functional and growing towards something genuinely good. But he was also busy with the physical work of the ranch, and Eleanor had time and skills, and found the work satisfying in a way that surprised her, the intersection of language and commerce and practicality. Hector, who had built himself a small separate cabin on the north side of the property in the spring, and who had become something between a ranch foreman and an extended family member, in the way of people who choose each other deliberately over long years, came by the main house regularly and was unfailingly kind. He had brought her in September a small carved figure of a horse that he said was a habit he had gotten into when he was young and had never stopped, and she had put it on the mantel where it sat next to a framed copy of the first letter James had written her, which she had framed in August and which James had shaken his head at, and then looked at with an expression that told her he was not actually displeased. The child was born on a December morning in 1874, with Margaret Hale present because Margaret had some experience as a midwife, and because Eleanor wanted her friend, and with James in the next room in a state that Hector later described as the worst 12 hours I have ever witnessed a human being survive while perfectly healthy. The child was a boy, 7 pounds, and loud about it from the first moment, with James's jaw and Eleanor's dark eyes and an opinion about everything that made itself known immediately and did not subsequently quiet. They named him Thomas, after Eleanor's father, with the middle name Henry, after a horse James had been particularly fond of, a choice that Eleanor had agreed to on the grounds that it would make an excellent story later. James held Thomas for the first time with both his large calloused hands occupied entirely by this small new person, and his face did something that Eleanor, watching from the bed, would spend a long time trying to describe properly and eventually decide simply required witnessing. He said very quietly, "Hello, you're going to be all right, I'll make sure of it." She thought about that promise and the certainty behind it, and she thought about the letter she had received 2 years ago now, the one that smelled of horse sweat and open prairie, and she thought about a man she had never met who had written to a schoolteacher for help understanding a contract, and about all the ways in which a person could arrive at a life they had not seen coming. Thomas grew the way babies grew on the frontier, quickly and with tremendous noise, and James proved to be the kind of father Eleanor had suspected he would be, attentive and patient and consistent, treating the small person with the same fundamental fairness he brought to all things, which Thomas responded to, in the way of very young children who can distinguish between being managed and being respected, with a particular and ferocious attachment. Eleanor returned to the schoolhouse in the spring of 1875, with Thomas bundled warm and brought along for the first weeks, until the logistics of childcare settled into a workable shape. She had negotiated with the school board, firmly and cheerfully, that the school day would end at 3 rather than 4 on Thursdays, which gave her an earlier ride home on the evenings when James was expecting buyers or needed to be elsewhere on the ranch. The board agreed. They had learned over the past 2 years that Eleanor Voss, who was now Eleanor Calloway, was a woman who proposed reasonable things in unreasonable tones, and that meeting her somewhere in the middle was generally the wisest approach. The rocking sea grew. James expanded the herd carefully, buying well and selling at the right times, and by the summer of 1875, he had 60 head and was buying the adjacent parcel he had been eyeing since before the letter writing began, the one with the second reliable water source, a detail that Hector had identified as transformative for the ranch's carrying capacity. The purchase was completed cleanly, with James reading every word of the contract himself before signing it, and Eleanor reviewing it alongside him, and the two of them sitting at the kitchen table over coffee going through it clause by clause with the same focused enjoyment they had always brought to a shared problem. "You know," James said, setting down the final page, "when I sent that first letter asking about contracts, I didn't expect to end up here." "Where did you expect to end up?" Eleanor asked. He looked around the kitchen at Thomas sleeping in his cradle near the wood stove, at the books on the shelf, at the framed letter on the mantel, at her. "Not here," he said. "Something smaller. I didn't know to expect this." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I didn't either," she said. In the fall of 1875, Hector Ruiz met a woman named Catalina Mendez, who was the sister of one of the hands James had hired for the fall cattle drive, a fact that James noted to Eleanor with tremendous satisfaction, because Hector had been telling him for 2 years that he had no interest in complications of a personal nature. Catalina was 26, forthright and funny, and she looked at Hector the way Eleanor had been told she looked at James, which Hector found deeply disarming. By January of 1876, he had proposed, and by March they were married in the same church in Abilene, with James standing up for Hector and Eleanor and Catalina having established a friendship with the particular speed of women who recognize each other immediately. It was Catalina who said, On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1876, sitting on the porch of the main house with Eleanor while the two men were somewhere in the south pasture doing something that required much walking and pointing. "Do you know what Hector told me? He said James started writing to you because a land agent was trying to cheat him, and he needed a smart person to read the contract. And then the smart person corrected his spelling, and he was absolutely finished." Eleanor looked out across the spring prairie and felt the warmth in her chest that she had come to associate with the particular pleasure of being known. "He came back for the grammar corrections," she said, which was not entirely not true. "Hector says he came back because you were the first person who had ever bothered," Catalina said, and then looked at Eleanor with the directness of a woman who says what she means, to explain rather than just judge. Eleanor thought about that for a long while, about the postscript in the first letter, the one she had written at the end explaining not just that something was wrong but why the correct form was correct, and about James writing back to say that that was the thing that had mattered, being treated as someone for whom understanding was possible and worth the trouble. She had not thought of it as a particularly significant act. She had simply written the way she taught, with the assumption that every person in front of her was capable of learning and deserved to have the learning made clear. It had changed everything. She supposed that was worth thinking about. By the summer of 1876, Eleanor had found her way into a rhythm that she would not have been able to describe to her Ohio self, but that felt, in the living of it, completely natural. She taught through the school year. She rode home to the rocking sea in the evenings. She managed the ranch correspondence and James managed the land. And on Sundays they all, which now included Hector and Catalina and Thomas, and increasingly Thomas's small and growing personhood, gathered at the main house for a long meal that lasted into the afternoon, and involved a great deal of talking and sometimes Hector playing the guitar, which he did very well, and sometimes James reading aloud from whatever book they were currently working through, because they had established a habit of reading together in the evenings, and it had become as fundamental to the household as the fire in the wood stove. James had, by this point, read more books than Eleanor would have predicted when she had sent him the first Dickens with its note in the front cover, and he had opinions about all of them, thoughtful and sometimes contrarian opinions that he expressed in the clean and exact written voice that had grown out of those early careful letters. And he had begun to correspond with a book dealer in Kansas City who sent new volumes quarterly, and who had written to James to say that his recommendations were the best he received from any of his customers. James had shown Eleanor that letter with an expression she described to Margaret as a man who has no idea what to do with a compliment and is trying to be dignified about it. "What did you say?" Margaret asked. "I told him I agreed completely and that he should write back and say so." "Did he?" "He did, and he spelled everything correctly." Eleanor was expecting their second child in the fall of 1876. A fact she had told James on a September evening on the front porch of the rocking sea, with the stars coming out one at a time, and Thomas asleep inside, and James had taken her hand and held it with the same steadiness as always and said, "Good. Thomas needs the company. He's developing opinions faster than I can keep up with." "He gets that from you," she said. "He gets it from both of us," James said, which was fairer and probably more accurate. The second child was born in March of 1877, a girl this time, smaller and quieter than Thomas had been, and with Eleanor's coloring entirely, dark-eyed and brown-haired, and regarding the world from her first moments with a calm, assessing look that James said reminded him of someone he knew. "She has your expression," he said. "What expression?" "The one you had when you opened the door of the schoolhouse the first time," he said. "Like she's deciding whether this situation is going to be acceptable." Eleanor looked at her daughter and thought that was exactly right. They named her Clara, after nobody in particular and both of them in a general sense, because she looked like herself from the very beginning, and they felt it would be wrong to name her after anyone else. Clara was 6 weeks old when Eleanor received a letter from her aunt in St. Louis. The aunt who had written years ago with concerns about frontier cowboys and practical considerations. A letter which said that the aunt had been told by mutual acquaintances who had visited Abilene that Eleanor seemed to be doing very well, and that her husband was spoken of respectably, and which contained the nearest thing to an apology that the aunt was constitutionally capable of producing. A statement that she was glad Eleanor had found her way, and that she hoped the children were thriving. Eleanor wrote back warmly and specifically, describing Thomas's current state, which involved a great deal of running and a recent passionate interest in the horses, and Clara's particular quiet watchfulness, and the ranch and the school in James, and the life that had been built in Kansas out of a letter that smelled of horse sweat and a postscript about grammar. James read the letter before she sent it because he read most of her correspondence as she read most of his, a habit that had grown naturally out of the writing that had always been between them. He read to the last paragraph and looked up. "You didn't tell her how it started," he said. "How do you mean?" "The letter." The first one, the bad spelling. His mouth had the slight shift at the corners that she had learned to recognize. "I thought the explanation might take more paper than I had," she said. "The short version," he said, "is that you corrected my grammar and I wrote back to ask you to correct it in person." "That is the very short version," she agreed. "It's accurate, though. It is entirely accurate." He handed her back the letter and she added a final line to it before she sealed it. It began, if you are curious, with a letter about a land contract and a postscript about grammar, and it turned out that was sufficient. She sent the letter. Spring moved into a full Kansas summer, and the rocking sea was by now a genuinely prosperous concern, the expanded herd and the additional pasture land producing a return that had allowed James to replace the weathered main house roof and add a second bedroom and build a proper porch across the full front of the house, a porch that Eleanor had claimed with 2 chairs and a small table within the first week of its completion, because she had discovered that the best place to do correspondence was in the open air, with the prairie stretching out in front of her. She sat on that porch on a July evening in 1877, with Clara sleeping in the cradle beside her, and Thomas somewhere inside with James, who was reading to him from a volume of illustrated natural history that Thomas had become obsessed with on the strength of a single page about horses, and she was writing a letter to the school board about the new schoolhouse that was finally, after 4 years of discussion, actually going to be built. She could hear James's voice through the open window, low and steady, reading aloud with the particular pleasure he brought to reading now, a pleasure that was very different from the careful, halting deliberateness of those first months, and she could hear Thomas interjecting with questions, which was Thomas's primary mode of engaging with everything. And she thought about a man who had started working cattle at 10 years old with no schooling and a father who did not prioritize it, and who had written a letter asking a schoolteacher for help because he was too honest to sign something he did not understand, and who now read aloud to his son in the evenings as a matter of preference and joy. She thought about the cedar box under the bed in the room they shared, the one that held all the letters from the beginning, the very first one with its catastrophic spelling and its tremendous earnest sincerity, and all the letters after it, the long curve of them, each one a little cleaner than the last, all of them honest in the way that only James could be honest, which was completely and without performance. She thought she should write him a letter, not for any practical reason, just because. She took a fresh piece of paper from the stack she kept on the small table and dipped her pen and wrote, "Dear James, you spelled received incorrectly in that first letter, and embarrassed, and you wrote don't want to sign nothing, which is a double negative. I thought you should know that none of these things mattered at all compared to the fact that you wrote back to ask me to correct them in person. I am very glad you did. The sky above the rocking sea is doing its best colors at this particular moment, which you cannot see because you are inside reading to Thomas, so I am describing it to you instead. It is orange and then purple, and the first stars are coming out one at a time, like lanterns being lit in a very large house. Yours, Eleanor. She folded it and left it on the table where he would find it in the morning. He found it at breakfast, while she was feeding Clara, and Thomas was already outside demanding to see the horses, which was his first activity of every morning with no exceptions. James read it leaning against the kitchen counter with his coffee, and she watched him read it without looking like she was watching him. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest and went to start the day. That evening he left a note on her table, the porch table where she did her writing. "Dear Eleanor," it said, "I know about the double negative. I knew about it when I wrote it. I was 28 years old and I had been working cattle for 18 years, and I had never sent a letter to anyone I needed something from because I was too proud to show what I didn't know. I sent it to you because Hector told me you were real smart and kind about learning, and I decided it was more important to understand the contract than to seem like I already understood everything. I did not expect to find a person in the reply. I found the most important person I have ever known. I think about that first letter sometimes, and I am not ashamed of the spelling. It got me here. Yours always, James. P.S. You left a dangling modifier in the third sentence of your letter. I am choosing to find it charming." Eleanor read the postscript and made a sound that was emphatically not a schoolteacher's sound, being composed equally of laughter and something considerably more tender. And she pressed the note against her heart and sat on the porch of the rocking sea in the evening air with Clara murmuring beside her and Thomas's voice, carrying from somewhere near the barn and the Kansas summer sky, going on forever in every direction, thinking that she had set out to correct a man's grammar and had instead, in the most roundabout and unexpected and entirely perfect way, found where she was supposed to be. The years settled in around them like good weather. Thomas grew tall and opinionated and horse-mad, as James had been at his age, and began his schooling with an enthusiasm that Eleanor suspected had as much to do with the pleasure of learning she had tried to model as anything innate, though he also had, unmistakably, his father's tenacity when he set himself to a thing. Clara was quieter and deeper and read everything she could reach by the age of 4, climbing onto shelves to get at books placed out of the way, a habit that James said reminded him of someone. "She gets it from both of us," Eleanor said, which was fairer and probably more accurate. Hector and Catalina had a son of their own in 1877, a boy named Miguel who was from his earliest days in a state of perpetual motion that exhausted everyone around him and seemed to energize him further, and who and Thomas formed an alliance of such combined energy and creativity that their parents began to regard each other with a specific kind of weary solidarity that was also, underneath it, a deep pleasure in the friendship. The schoolhouse was built in 1878, a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms and a stable for the horses of children who rode in from outlying farms and ranches, and Eleanor stood in the new building on the first day of the school year and thought about the leaking roof of the old one, and felt something that she thought was probably pride, not in the building, but in the long line of effort and intention that had gone into the years between that first September and this one. James came to see the new schoolhouse on a Saturday, as he had come to the old one, and he walked through both rooms with the same serious attention he had brought the very first time, looking at the new desks and the better books and the shelves that were full by plenty and not by careful selection. And he stood at the window of the second room looking out at the prairie, and she stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "Someone worked very hard to make this feel like something." She had said it first, she realized, years ago about the old schoolhouse, and he had listened and remembered and given it back to her now about this one. "It matters," she said. "It matters enormously," he agreed. They rode home to the rocking sea together in the September afternoon, their horses steady on the familiar track, with the grass tall and the sky going its best colors and the prairie as wide and open as it had always been, unchanged by everything that had happened within it, And they rode side by side and talked about small things, about Thomas and Clara and Miguel's latest escapade and Hector's new fence design, and the book they were reading in the evenings. And the talk was easy and warm, and went on most of the way home. When the rocking sea came into view, the windmill and the roof line and then the whole of it against the horizon, James said, "I've been thinking about writing something." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "Something longer than a letter," he said. "About the ranch, about this place, what it takes to build something from nothing out here." He was looking ahead at the spread, not at her, and she could see him thinking. "I don't know if I can. I know I can write a letter. Whether I can sustain a thing longer than that is a different question." "You sustained a conversation for 4 months before we had ever met," she said, "and you have been sustaining it for 5 years since. I think you can write a longer thing." He looked at her then, with the expression she had first seen in the schoolhouse doorway with his hat in his hands, the one that was too many things to separate out. "You would say that," he said. "I would say it because it is true," she said, "and also because I would very much like to read it." He began writing that winter, in the evenings after the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet, at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, and she sat across from him at the same table doing her own work, the correspondence and the school preparation and sometimes just reading, and they were together in the lamplight in the way they had always been best together, each doing their own work in the same room, the particular companionship of shared industry. He wrote slowly, slower than his letters, and sometimes he read her sections out loud and she listened, and said what she thought honestly, as she had always said what she thought. And sometimes she suggested a better word or a clearer construction, and he took the suggestions with the same lack of defensiveness he had brought to the grammar corrections years ago, considering each one and keeping the ones that served the work and setting aside the ones that didn't. And it was very much, she thought, like the letters at the beginning, him working at the language and her helping him find the best form for what he already knew how to say. By the spring of 1879, he had something he was willing to call finished, a long account of the building of the rocking sea from the day he had arrived with the money he had saved, and looked at 460 acres of Kansas grassland, and tried to understand what it would take to make it a working ranch. It was honest and specific and written in his own voice, dry and clear and occasionally deeply funny, and it was in places very beautiful, in the way that precise and honest language about real things is beautiful. He sent it to the book dealer in Kansas City, who had been sending him volumes for years, not because he expected anything, but because the man seemed to know something about writing, and James wanted an honest assessment. The book dealer wrote back 6 weeks later to say that he had read it twice, and that he knew a publisher in St. Louis who had recently expressed interest in accounts of frontier ranching from people who had actually done it, and would James be willing to correspond with him. James showed Eleanor the letter across the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. She read it. She set it down. She looked at him. "Well," she said, "I told you." "You did tell me," he said. "You will need to write to the publisher," she said. "I will check the letter before you send it." He looked at her with a slight shift at the corners of his mouth. "My grammar has been perfectly reliable for 4 years," he said. "It has been very good," she said. "But some things bear checking." "You just want to read it first," he said. "Naturally," she said. He wrote the letter and she read it, and it was, in fact, perfectly grammatical throughout, clean and direct and exactly the right thing to send, and she said so, and he sent it. The publisher was interested. The book was published the following year, in 1880, with Eleanor's help on the final editing, which she undertook with tremendous pleasure, and which James described to Hector as the most educational experience of his adult life, a statement that Hector received with a laugh and Eleanor received with a raised eyebrow that meant she thought it was probably accurate. The title page read 12 Miles West, Building a Life on the Kansas Frontier, by James Calloway of the Rocking Sea. The dedication read, "For Eleanor, who corrected my grammar and thereby changed everything." She read the dedication sitting in her chair on the porch of the rocking sea in the summer of 1880, with Thomas playing somewhere in the direction of the barn, and Clara reading beside her with a focus that was entirely her own, and the Kansas summer going on around her in every direction. And she held the book carefully and thought about a Tuesday in 1873 when she had nearly thrown a letter into the fire before she read a single word. She was very glad she had not thrown it into the fire. James came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her and saw the book in her hands and sat down in the other chair. "Well," he said. "The dedication," she said, "has a dangling modifier." He looked at her. "I am choosing to find it charming," she said. He laughed, the low, real laugh she had been hearing for 7 years now, the one she could still feel in her chest when it happened, and he reached over and took her free hand in both of his, and held it with the same steadiness he had held everything. The contracts and the books and the calves and the children and the long, full days of a life built from nothing on the Kansas prairie. The same steadiness he had always brought to things he intended to keep. The prairie stretched out around the rocking sea in every direction, enormous and golden and certain, and the sky above it was the blue that made you think somebody meant it, and the creek ran through the cottonwoods to the south with the particular reliability of water that has found its place. And on the front porch of the house they had built into a home, James Calloway held his wife's hand, and Eleanor Calloway held a book that had begun as a letter and a postscript. And everything that had happened between that beginning and this moment felt, in the living of it, like exactly what it was. The whole and entire shape of a life, closed at every seam, complete.